Vivid verses.
The apartment on Verano Street had good bones. That was the first thing the letting agent told me. And I remember thinking it was an odd phrase, as if the walls might buckle without structural integrity hiding beneath the plaster. But she was right. High ceilings, original cornicing, casement windows that actually opened without a fight. I signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon in late September, and by Sunday, I'd arranged the furniture exactly once and decided it was right. I've always been like that. I take my time before committing, but once I commit, I stop second-guessing. My name is Cal Renner. I work as a systems architect for a mid-sized logistics firm called Brackford Solutions. The work is precise and mostly invisible. I build the infrastructure that makes other people's jobs run smoothly, and nobody notices it until something breaks. I prefer it that way. I'm not wired for applause. My routine that autumn was modest and deliberate. I was up by 6, at my desk by 8, done by 6 in the evening unless a project demanded otherwise. 2 evenings a week, I ran the circuit around Calver Park. Friday nights, I cooked something ambitious and ate alone with a novel propped against a water glass. On Saturdays, I visited my mother and stepfather in Orland, a 40-minute drive northeast, and we ate lunch at their kitchen table and talked about ordinary things. They were both getting older in the quiet way people do, and I liked being there. I mention all of this not because it's remarkable, but because context matters. By the time the conflict arrived, I want you to understand exactly what kind of man I was and exactly what kind of life I constructed. It will make everything that follows legible. I met Petra at a dinner party hosted by my colleague Rose and her husband Tom. 8 people, a rectangular table, a risotto that Tom had clearly spent the better part of the afternoon on. Petra was seated across from me and 2 seats to the left, which meant I spent the evening catching her in my peripheral vision more than looking at her directly. She was a graphic designer who had recently gone freelance after 4 years at a brand studio called Cowlowell and Fitch. She had precise opinions about typography, a dry which she deployed carefully, and a way of listening that made you feel your words were being properly received rather than queued up for response. These things registered in a low-key way. I wasn't swept off my feet. I was interested. We exchanged numbers at the end of the evening. I texted 3 days later, suggesting a coffee at Holt's on Prescott Lane. She replied within the hour. We met the following Tuesday. By December, we were seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week. By January, she had a key to the Verano Street apartment. The first months had the quality that I imagine all new relationships have when both people are genuinely curious about each other, a continuous, pleasant sense of discovery. Petra was funny in a way that sneaked up on you. She made excellent decisions about small things, where to sit in a restaurant, when to leave a party, and I respected that. She was hardworking in the particular way of people who've gone freelance, not out of desperation, but out of conviction. She had clients she turned down because the work didn't interest her, and she could afford to. We disagreed about films regularly. She thought psychological thrillers were lazy. I thought a lazy thriller was still better than a good drama about a marriage dissolving. This became a running argument we both enjoyed. She got along with Rose, which mattered. She came to Orland twice, and my mother liked her, which also mattered, though I tried not to weight it too heavily. I've seen men let their mother's enthusiasm carry them past their own better judgment. What I noticed more slowly, the way you notice a piece of furniture has shifted slightly in a room, was a pattern in how certain conversations ended. The first instance was in February. I'd mentioned I was planning to drive to Orland the following Saturday because my stepfather was having a minor procedure and my mother had sounded tired on the phone. Petra was quiet for a moment, then said, "I guess I'm not important." I looked at her. "I saw you Tuesday and Wednesday," I said. "I'll be back Saturday evening." "It's fine," she said. The tone suggested it wasn't fine, but that she decided not to say so. I went to Orland. My mother was grateful I came. My stepfather was home and resting by the time I arrived, and we spent the afternoon watching an old quiz program on his tablet. When I got back to Verano Street that evening, Petra was there. She still had the key, and she'd made pasta, and we ate it and watched something on StreamFlow, and the Saturday incident wasn't mentioned again. I filed it, not with alarm, just as data. The second instance came in March. Brackford was in the middle of a major infrastructure upgrade, the kind that requires someone to be available at unusual hours while systems migrate and the inevitable problems surface. I'd worked late 3 nights in a row, and on the third night Petra called at 9:30. "Are you coming over?" "Not tonight. I'm still in the middle of this migration, and I need to be available until it stabilizes. Probably another 2 hours. You care more about work than me." I didn't respond immediately. I let the sentence sit for a moment, the way you let a suspect equation sit before you look for where the error entered. "That's not a conclusion the evidence supports," I said. "What does that mean?" "It means I have a professional obligation that requires my attention tonight, and that doesn't tell you anything about how I feel about you." There was a pause. "I just miss you. I'll see you Thursday," I said. The migration completed cleanly. I documented the process and went to bed at midnight. On Thursday, she was warm and funny, and we had a good evening. But I'd added a second data point, and I was starting to see the shape of something I didn't have a name for yet. April was when the pattern became legible. I'd started training for a half marathon in a low-key way. Nothing extreme, just adding a longer run on Sunday mornings and adjusting my diet slightly. I mentioned this to Petra on a Wednesday evening. Her response was light, surface-level casual, but the content was precise. Must be nice to be so self-focused. There was again the same grammatical structure, the same mechanism. I thought about it on my run that Sunday, the long one, 9 miles around the Calver Circuit and back through the Breck Hill residential streets. I have a habit of turning problems over while I run, using the rhythm to slow my thinking down enough that I can see structure rather than just content. What I was looking at was this: 3 separate categories of my autonomy. Family, professional obligation, personal health had each been framed separately and in different words as a form of betrayal or selfishness. The framing changed, but the geometry was identical. My choosing anything that wasn't Petra was presented as evidence that Petra didn't matter. The structure only worked if I accepted its premise, that my time and energy were a fixed resource that belonged primarily to her, and any expenditure elsewhere was a withdrawal from her account. I hadn't accepted that premise, but I noticed that each time the structure appeared, there was a moment, brief, instinctive, where I felt something adjacent to guilt. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because the framing was designed to produce that reflex. It was well engineered. I found myself almost admiring the craftsmanship, the way you might admire a trap, even as you step around it. I completed 9 miles and came home and made a protein-heavy breakfast and felt entirely fine about the run. What I didn't yet know was that the pattern had a second component I hadn't seen yet. May arrived with the particular warmth that makes London's lesser imitations feel briefly adequate. Verano Street had a tree outside the first-floor window that was suddenly and extravagantly green, and I'd taken to leaving the casement window open in the evenings so the room could breathe. Petra had started spending more nights at the flat. This wasn't a formal arrangement. She still had her own place in the Wexford Lane area, 15 minutes away, but it had become the gravitational default. She'd gradually populated the bathroom shelf. A cardigan had appeared on the chair by the window and remained there long enough to become furniture. I didn't object to this. I want to be clear about that. I enjoyed her company, and I wasn't manufacturing distance. But I noticed that the density of her presence had increased without any particular conversation having occurred about it. Things had moved without being moved. I filed this as well. My friend Owen called one afternoon in mid-May. Owen and I had been close since our mid-20s. We'd worked together briefly at a place called Hartwell Systems before going in different directions, and we'd maintained a friendship with a minimum of maintenance, which is the best kind. He was proposing a weekend trip to his family's cabin near the Breckholt Reservoir. Himself, his partner Yanni, me, and a couple of others. A long weekend, early June. Fishing, hiking, doing very little well. I said yes immediately. I like the Breckholt area. I like Owen. The decision was simple. When I mentioned it to Petra that evening, there was a pause before she spoke. A whole long weekend? Thursday evening to Sunday. For days. With people I don't really know. With Owen. You've met Owen. Once at Rose's thing. Another pause. I guess I'm not important. There it was. Word for word this time. The same phrase, deployed again like a key that had been used before on the same lock. Here's what I noticed in real time. I didn't feel the guilt reflex this time. The machinery was visible enough now that I could watch it operate without being caught in it. What I felt instead was a quiet, clarifying certainty. I hear you saying that, I said, but I'm going to Breckholt. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, I think, at the absence of the negotiation she'd been expecting. Okay, she said. The conversation ended there, but a different one had begun silently in my head. I want to be precise about something here, because I think it matters. I wasn't cataloging Petra's behavior in order to build a case against her. I'm not wired for scorekeeping or grudge holding. What I was doing was paying attention, the same way I pay attention to any system I'm working in. Not to find fault, but to understand the actual architecture rather than the architecture as presented. And what the architecture was showing me was a system with a very specific design. My autonomy was framed as betrayal, and the framing was consistent across categories. Family, work, health, friendships, in a way that suggested it wasn't reactive but structural. This wasn't Petra getting occasionally hurt. This was a recurring mechanism. The question I was sitting with was whether Petra was consciously operating it or whether it had become so habitual that she no longer had access to the choice. I didn't know the answer to that yet, but it was starting to matter less than the other question. Was I going to continue living inside a system that framed my ordinary, reasonable existence as selfishness? The answer to that one was already decided. I just needed to understand the full picture before I acted on it. The full picture arrived through Owen accidentally in late May. We were at a bar called the Foresters on Cranwick Street, having a quiet beer before his birthday dinner at a Turkish place nearby. We'd arrived early and had 20 minutes to ourselves, and I mentioned in a general way that I was navigating something with Petra. Owen is a careful listener. He didn't jump in. He waited until I described what I'd observed, the pattern, the phrases, the structure, and then he said, "Have you talked to anyone else who knows her?" I hadn't. I said so. "You should talk to Rose," he said. "Not to get intel. Just, I think there's context you might not have." There was something in his tone, not warning exactly, more like the tone of someone who has decided what to say and what not to say and is choosing carefully. I noted it and let it rest. The birthday dinner was good. Yanni had organized a small group of 8. The Turkish restaurant was loud and warm, and the evening had the easy quality of time spent well. I didn't bring Petra up again, but I thought about what Owen had said. The following week, I had lunch with Rose at a cafe near Brackford's offices. She'd suggested it for entirely ordinary reasons. She wanted to discuss a project handoff, and we talked work for the first 40 minutes. Towards the end of the lunch, with the same kind of deliberateness I recognized in myself, she set her fork down and said, "Can I ask you something about Petra?" "Yes," I said. "How's it going?" "With you too. There are things I'm trying to understand," I said. "What do you know?" Rose is direct, which I've always valued. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Petra and I have a shared history that she may not have fully told you about. We were close before I met Tom. Very close for a couple of years. And I saw some patterns then that I recognized when you started seeing her. Why didn't you say anything earlier? Because I wasn't sure they'd resurface, and because it's not my place to brief you on your own girlfriend. She paused. But if you're seeing what I think you're seeing, I'll tell you what I know. I said, tell me. What Rose told me was this. Petra had been in a long relationship before me, for years with a man named Fun, who Rose had met several times. The relationship had ended badly, not because of anything dramatic, but because of a slow accumulation of the same patterns I'd been observing. Fun had apparently tried to have a direct conversation about it once, and Petra had reframed it as an attack. The relationship ended 6 months later, and Petra had described the end to Rose as Fun abandoning her. Rose had maintained careful distance since then, close enough to remain friendly, but not so close as to be drawn into anything. She'd been watching my relationship with this slightly anxious alertness of someone hoping to be proved wrong. She hadn't been proved wrong. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I just think you deserve to have the context. Appreciated, I said. I walked back to the Brackford offices and sat at my desk and looked at my screen without opening anything for about 4 minutes. Here's what I was thinking. The pattern wasn't reactive. It was established. Petra had been running this same geometry for years, probably longer than she'd been conscious of running it. The framing autonomy as betrayal structure wasn't something I triggered. It was something she brought to every relationship and deployed reliably, which meant that trying to correct it, trying to explain it, trying to gently or directly challenge it would produce the same outcome it had produced with Fun. The conversation would be reframed as an attack, and I would become the person who had abandoned her. This was important information. It meant the only available exit that preserved my self-respect was a clean one. I want to tell you about the dinner party at Luke and BEA's, because it's where the last piece arrived. Luke was a friend of Petra's. They'd worked together briefly at Cal Lowell and Fitch before she went freelance. And he and his partner B hosted a dinner in their terrace house on Aldgate Row in early June, just before my Breckhole trip. 12 people, 2 tables pushed together in a long kitchen diner. Paper lanterns B had made herself strung along the window. The kind of evening that looks effortless and is clearly the result of significant effort. I've been looking forward to it. I enjoy that mid-sized group dynamic. Large enough that conversations can cross-pollinate, small enough that you can track the whole room. Petra and I arrived together. She knew most of the room. I knew Luke and B slightly, and Owen and Yanni were there as well, which was a comfortable anchor. The first hour was easy. Wine, introductions, the pleasant circling of people figuring out their conversational affinities. I ended up in a corner of the kitchen with a man named Aries, who turned out to be a civil engineer working on drainage infrastructure for the council. We talked about systems. His work and mine have more in common than you'd expect, and it was one of those conversations that builds its own momentum and carries you away from the room for a while. When I surfaced from it, I noticed Petra across the room in conversation with B and a woman I didn't know. She glanced over and caught my eye, and something in her expression was tight in a way I recognized. I registered it and returned to my conversation for another few minutes, then made my way over and joined her group naturally. She didn't introduce me. I introduced myself. At the table, I was seated at the far end from Petra. The pushed-together arrangement meant we were 8 seats apart. This was nobody's design. It was the geometry of 12 people at a long surface. But I felt, rather than saw, Petra's attention on me throughout the first 2 courses. Between the main and the dessert, she appeared at my elbow. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Her voice was low but not urgent. We went to the hallway. "You've barely spoken to me all evening," she said. I looked at her. I was genuinely surprised by this framing. We arrived together. We've been at a dinner party with 10 other people. You were talking to that guy for almost an hour. We were having a good conversation. Right. The word was a container for a great deal that wasn't being said. I thought, here it is again. The same structure. My engagement with the world, with the people and ideas in a room, framed as a withdrawal from her. As if my attention is a resource that belongs to her first, and any other expenditure is a form of taking. Petra, I said carefully, you've built a system where my autonomy is framed as betrayal. Anytime I engage with my family, my work, my health, my friends, my conversations, it becomes evidence that you don't matter. I'm not living in that system. She stared at me. What does that even mean? It means what it says. So you're saying I'm a problem. I'm saying there's a pattern I've been observing for several months, and I've thought about it carefully, and I'm telling you what I've concluded. This isn't the place for this, she said. Agreed, I said. We'll talk properly this week. And I went back to the table and I ate the excellent lemon tart that we had made, and I talked to the people around me, and I didn't perform anything. Not anger, not distress, not forced jollity. I was simply present, which is the only way I know how to be. On the way home in the car, Petra was quiet. I drove and did not fill the silence. I'd like to tell you I'd already fully decided by then, but that wouldn't be quite accurate. What I decided was that the relationship couldn't continue on its current terms, and that the current terms couldn't be renegotiated, and that the conversation I needed to have was an ending rather than a correction. But I gave myself the week, as I'd said. I wasn't in a hurry. Hurry is for people who haven't thought things through. The week clarified one more thing. On the Tuesday, Petra came over. I'd cooked, nothing ambitious, just a pasta and a salad and some bread. And we ate at the table, and the conversation was careful on both sides, the way it gets when something large is being orbited without landing. Then she said, I've been thinking about what you said at Luke and BEA's. Okay, I think you've been looking for reasons to pull back. I think you've been keeping score, and you've decided I'm not worth the effort. I watched her say this and thought, there it is. The fin outcome. The accusation that my noticing is the same thing as attacking. The framing of my observation as hostility rather than honesty. What you're describing, I said, is a version of events where my paying attention is the problem, where me noticing a recurring structure and naming it is the act of aggression. You said I was manipulative. I said you'd built a system. Those aren't the same thing. They feel the same. I believe that, I said. But how something feels to the person doing it isn't the same as what it does to the person receiving it. She was quiet for a moment. What are you saying, Cal? I'm saying I've been honest with you about what I've observed. And I'm being honest with you now. I don't think this is working. Because I'm not perfect. Because the structure of how we operate has been making my ordinary life, my family, my work, my health, my friendships feel like betrayals. And I'm not willing to keep feeling that way. So you're leaving? Yes. It was said simply, without drama. She looked at me for a long moment, and I held her look steadily. I wasn't performing composure. I was actually composed in the way that comes from having already done your thinking before the conversation rather than during it. She left about 20 minutes later. She took the cardigan from the chair by the window. She left her key on the kitchen counter without being asked. I noticed that. A small, deliberate punctuation mark. I didn't know whether it was meant as dignity or as a final reframe. See, I'm the one leaving things behind, and I found that I didn't need to know. I washed the plates and the glasses and put them away. The reservoir at Breckholt is not beautiful in a postcard sense. It's functional, wide, with a flat gray quality and overcast light that I find more restful than the self-consciously picturesque. Owen's family cabin sits 50 meters back from the eastern bank, surrounded by mixed woodland that gets noisy with birds in the early morning. There were 4 of us: Owen, Yanni, me, and Owen's university friend Gail, who turned out to be a quiet, observant person with a good working knowledge of local fishing regulations and an extremely well-curated playlist for early mornings. I was the only one without a partner, and this wasn't treated as a subject. The first morning I was up at 6 and outside with a coffee before anyone else stirred. The reservoir was still and pale. A heron was doing absolutely nothing about 40 meters out, standing in the shallows with the patience of a creature that has resolved the question of where to be. I thought about the previous week without anguish. I went over the facts as I knew them, the pattern, the structure, the conversation at Luke and BEA's, the Tuesday ending. I was looking for any decision I'd made that I regretted or wanted to revisit. I didn't find one. This is what I mean when I say growth is measured in self-respect. Not in healing, not in the warm closure of understanding why things happened or what they meant about me or about her. Just in the clean knowledge that I'd paid attention, thought carefully, spoken honestly, and acted deliberately. I hadn't been unkind. I hadn't been reactive. I hadn't begged or pleaded or issued ultimatums or performed emotions I didn't feel. I'd simply named what I saw and made the decision that naming implied. The heron moved, eventually. It walked 3 deliberate steps, and then was still again. I drank my coffee. Owen came out at 6:30 with his own mug and sat in the adjacent chair. We watched the reservoir for a while without talking. "How are you doing?" he said eventually. "Well," I said. "Rose told me she'd spoken to you." "I know you pointed her in that direction," I said. I wasn't sure it was my place to say anything directly, but I thought the context mattered. It did. "Thank you." Another quiet stretch. A wood pigeon was complaining about something in the tree-line. "For what it's worth," Owen said, "I think you handled it about as well as anyone could." "I don't know about that, but I handled it the way I could." He nodded. That was the end of the conversation about it, and I was grateful for the precise limit of it. Owen has always known when something needs to be said and when the saying of it is complete. We fished that afternoon, badly and cheerfully. Gail caught 2 small perch and released them with ceremony. I had a bite that came in nothing and spent the rest of the hour thinking about a Brackford infrastructure decision I'd been putting off, which is the kind of thinking that benefits from being placed in front of water. That evening we cooked on the cabin's outdoor grill. Gail had brought marinated lamb chops from a butcher in town called Grieve and Sons, which were exceptional, and drank moderately and talked until 11, which is about the exact right length of time for an evening like that. Before bed, I sat for a few minutes on the small wooden dock at the water's edge. The reservoir held the last of the light in a long, flat stripe. On the opposite bank, a car passed on the unseen road, its headlights making a brief, bright passage through the trees. I thought, I am 34 years old. I have a flat with good bones. I have a job I understand and do well. I have Owen and Yanni and Rose and Tom and Gail, and my mother and my stepfather recovering quietly in Orland. I have the half marathon in September, which I am going to run without apology. None of these things were in danger. None of them had ever been in danger. The system Petra had been running had only ever had the power I gave it, and I'd stopped giving it. A week after Breck Holt, I ran into Petra. Not by design. I was at Holt's on Prescott Lane, the same coffee shop where we'd had our first date, which was either irony or just geography, picking up a flat white on my way to the office. She was seated at the window table with a woman I didn't recognize, a laptop open between them. Freelance meeting, probably. She looked well. She was wearing a yellow jacket I'd always liked. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. The moment lasted about 2 seconds. A recognition, a small assessment, a mutual decision. She lifted her chin slightly in acknowledgement. I did the same. I collected my coffee and walked to the office. That was all. No conversation, no loaded silence, no scene. 2 people who had ended something looking at each other across a coffee shop and deciding, each independently, that there was nothing left to perform. I'm not going to pretend there was no feeling in that moment. There is something residual, complicated, not quite grief and not quite relief, the feeling of a door that's been properly closed. I registered it and kept walking. I've thought about whether I should have handled any of it differently. I've considered the question from several angles and arrived at the same answer each time. No, not because I was flawless. I'm certain there were moments I was more abrupt than I needed to be, moments where a softer approach might have produced the same outcome with less collateral feeling. But the fundamental decisions were sound. When I observed the pattern, I named it to myself rather than dismissing it. When I named it to Petra, I was direct but not cruel. When she offered me the fin outcome, your noticing is an attack, your naming is aggression, I didn't accept the frame. And when I ended things, I ended them cleanly, without negotiation, without attempting to extract an acknowledgement she wasn't capable of giving, without making her wrong in a way that required her to defend herself. The best response to manipulation isn't counter-manipulation. It isn't an argument. It isn't an ultimatum or a threat or a carefully constructed case presented in the hope of a verdict. It's refusal. Quiet, complete, dignified refusal to play the game on the terms the game requires. Because the game, the system, the structure, whatever you want to call it, only runs if you accept its premise. If you accept that your ordinary life is a form of selfishness, that your family and your work and your health and your friendships are resources being diverted from where they belong. Once you stop accepting that premise, the game has no board to run on. I hadn't stopped accepting it because I was clever. I'd stopped accepting it because I'd paid attention. The half marathon was in September. I crossed the finish line in 1 hour and 52 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than my target. Owen was there. He'd come to watch, which I hadn't expected and was quietly pleased about. He had a paper cup of bad coffee and made a moderately cutting remark about my finishing face, and I told him he could say what he liked because I just run further than he had. That Sunday, I drove to Orland. My stepfather had recovered well from his procedure and was in the garden doing something unnecessary, but clearly satisfying to a row of shrubs. My mother made lunch. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about the things on the table and the things outside the window and the ordinary details of our ordinary lives. I drove home as the light was going. The Verano Street apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Furniture placed once and correctly, casement window open, the October tree doing its last good work before the leaves let go. I made tea and sat with it. The room was quiet and mine, and I was neither lonely in it nor performing comfort. I was simply there, present, clear-headed, aware of what I'd come through and of what was, without sentimentality, intact. Everything that mattered was intact. That was enough.
Thanks for listening.